Welcome. Good afternoon. I am Amaney Jamal. I am the Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and it is my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this conversation. I am honored not only to introduce our keynote speaker, but also to welcome him back to SPIA. Ben Bernanke has built an impressive legacy as an accomplished economist, a dedicated public servant, a gifted teacher, and an influential thought leader. His achievements include the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, an 8-year tenure as chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System under 2 presidents, an additional 3 years as member of the Board of Governors, and the chairmanship of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. From 1985 to 2002, Ben was a professor of economics and public affairs here at the School of Public and International Affairs. He was the class of 1926 professor of economics and public affairs from 1994 to 1996, then the Howard Harrison and Gabriel Snyder Beck professor of economics and public affairs and chair of the economics department from 1996 to 2002. Ben has widely published on a wide variety of economic issues, including monetary policy, macroeconomics, and economic history, and he's the author of several scholarly books and 2 textbooks. Since leaving the Federal Reserve, he has continued writing articles and books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Courage to Act, a memoir of a crisis and its aftermath. Among many other recognitions, Ben is a recipient of Guggenheim and Sloan Fellowships and is a fellow of the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He holds a BA in economics from Harvard University and a PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. I am very grateful to Ben for his willingness to share his perspectives with us today. He will be in conversations with my colleague and friend Atif Mian as well, director of the Julis-Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance and the John H. Laporte Jr. Class of 1967, professor of economics, public policy, and finance. I look forward to their discussion. Thank you so much.
For joining us. Welcome back to Princeton, as Amaney said. I want to kick things off. I'm going to be asking some questions. I'm sure all of you have some questions for Ben as well. So let me start. Usually we all like to complain. The U.S. is not doing so well. Inflation might be too high and so on. But I want to start on a positive note. If you compare the U.S. with the rest of the world, the U.S. actually has done remarkably well. So, I'm thinking of the last 15, 20 years, the Great Recession, the COVID crisis. And every time we have a major crisis, the US comes out stronger relative to, let's say, Europe, Japan, or even Asia to some extent. And so the question I have for you is, what's behind this resilience? What do you attribute this to? And going forward, do you think there's something, we have some strength that's going to likely to remain with us?
Well, so we had a very difficult decade, of course, after the financial crisis. Slow recovery, at least we didn't have a debt crisis on top of that as Europe did. So let me talk a little bit more about the more recent recovery, which has been really the strongest of any major economy. It wasn't that long ago that everyone was predicting a recession for last year. And instead we had 3% plus growth, 4% in the second half. We had last January, 350,000 new jobs added. So why, what happened? Why was the economy so much stronger than anticipated? So let me talk short run, and I'll talk long run in a moment. I think there were 3 reasons why the US economy came out of the pandemic as strong as it did. The first was just sort of a spring effect. The economy was pressed down by the lockdowns, by the pandemic, and when that was released, we had a very strong rebound. It wasn't a normal expansion. And some of the things that were behind that included the fact that people had saved money during the lockdowns. They received money from the fiscal programs. You had monetary stimulus. So people came out and they wanted to spend. They had not been able to buy a car, for 3 years. They had what was called revenge spending, So people went out and they spent. On top of that, of course, firms had to re-employ workforces. The healthcare sector and the leisure and hospitality sectors are both about 10% of the workforce on average, but they have made up 20% of each of the hiring that we've seen in the last 18 months because they were depleted and they were trying to restore their workforce. So one reason was just that we had a basically healthy economy, healthy financial system, And when the constraints were removed, we had a pop back. Second reason is, and I think this is something that's not been, I mean, it's obvious, but I don't think it gets enough attention in the public media at least, is that this was mostly a supply-side recession, or very substantially. The pandemic itself was kind of a natural disaster, frankly. And on top of that, we had, of course, the oil price shock, the food price increases, supply chain issues, labor supply constraints, and so on. And so when those constraints eased, as we knew they would, the economy naturally, came back from that as well. And then finally, and I think this is very important both in the short run and the long run, immigration has been a big part of the story in the last couple of years. Congressional Budget Office just put out its report for deficit projections for the next 10 years, and it's very hard to calculate exactly how many immigrants there are in a given year, but according to the CBO, in the last 2 years, the population of the United States has grown by 6 million, of which 100% reflected net immigration. And when they have new people coming in and joining the labor force, that's why you can have so many jobs created, because you've got people to take those jobs. It's why consumption is strong, because you've got people coming to spend. And I think that made an enormous difference. And that's why the usual criteria, 100,000 jobs a month is normal, et cetera, did not apply in this case. And so, that's why, some of the reasons why this has been such a surprisingly strong recovery. I think going forward, now some of those factors are going to obviously diminish. We're not going to have, we've already gotten out of the pandemic, or mostly, and we're not going to have that stimulus again. But there are some very positive things to think about. Immigration being an important one. Someone pointed out to me that I'm the only American-born speaker today. Is that really? Think of all the talent that's been brought into the country from.
We didn't plan it this way. It was just if that's true.
I feel like I'm an affirmative action candidate. So anyway. That has obviously been a real strength of the U.S. economy for a long time, and if we don't screw it up, it'll continue to be an important strength. We have a lot of flexibility and entrepreneurship. The pandemic was actually a period of remarkably high business formation. A lot of people who were at home said, well, I'm going to start my own online, consulting business, or whatever it might have been. And I think, I'm not quite sure why, maybe it's the universities like Princeton and MIT and Harvard and Caltech and so on, but our technology is very, very competitive. We have many of the largest tech firms in the world are domiciled in the United States, and including not just, Google, but also you've got pharmaceutical companies, you've got we've had all this fracking, energy production here, which is basically a technological advance. So those are some of the positive things. Now we have a lot of negatives.
Is there a particular risk that you worry about going forward? That
I think
when the next shock comes,
there can always be another shock, and we've just learned from the pandemic that big shocks can occur without much warning, and we fumbled around quite a bit trying to deal with it. Although the development of the vaccine was another example of a rather remarkable technological achievement. I think it's trite to say, but it seems to me pretty obvious that our political dysfunction is a major impediment to good policy, and that's going to make us vulnerable to geopolitical and other shocks that could occur. Economically, I'm sure we'll talk more about the financial system and regulation and but I think there's still some weaknesses in the financial system, and that's of some concern. But it's the nature of shocks that they're shocks, and you don't necessarily know or don't know what they're going to be. But again, there are a lot of fundamental strengths which are encouraging.
If I can sort of move the conversation towards inflation, which is obviously something that you have always kept a close eye on, and in fact you are responsible for it for a while.
Wait a minute.
Not the rise in inflation, but maintaining it. That's what, just to be clear. Now, actually, Moritz presented a graph earlier. The US and other advanced economies as well, they did very well in sort of not surprising people with an inflationary shock for a while, for a few decades.
Sure.
Until COVID came along, and then we saw the inflation surprise shock that you're well familiar with. Now that it sort of seems to be, at least some of it, behind us, what have you learned from it, both in terms of like separating supply versus demand factors? That's number one. And number two, do you think going forward, would you change the way we think of monetary policy, the way we sort of plan and prepare for avoiding such surprises? Because that's sort of in the mandate, I suppose. So on those two dimensions, if you have to say anything.
Well, since I left the Fed and I've been at the Brookings Institution in Washington, I have been doing some research, and I have a paper with Olivier Blanchard on the causes of the inflation. And we develop a model which finds both the direct and indirect effects of various shocks. You know, for example, energy price shocks have direct effects on cost of living, but they have indirect effects. They affect the cost of producing other goods. They affect inflation expectations, which in turn affect wage demands. They affect workers' desire to catch up from lost wages. So there's a lot of indirect effects that are worth looking at, and that's what our model tries to do. And we estimated for the United States, and is currently being estimated for 10 other economies. And what we found was not terribly shocking, but when we decompose the inflation experience, we find naturally what people were concerned about early on was the demand side, that there was going to be, because of fiscal and monetary policy, there was going to be overstimulated economy and inflation coming from that side. And we found there was a modest amount of overstimulus from the demand side, and its effects, while relatively small, are persistent. They last a long time. Most of the actual inflation we found was from supply factors, and I mentioned those: energy prices, food prices, supply chains, labor supply, and those were the things that led us to 9% inflation numbers. But even though those supply side factors were quantitatively responsible for most of the inflation, they also tended to reverse. And so they have now mostly reversed, and that's why inflation has come down so much without a recession. And what we have left, there's a bit more to go on the supply side, but what we have left now is the residual of the demand side, wage pressure, and the labor market is coming into better balance, no question. But I think there's still a bit more work to do, to get all the way back. But honestly, although I cannot prove it, I didn't believe there was going to be a recession. And the main reason was because I thought that the reversal of the supply problems was actually going to be a positive for growth and employment, which seems to be the case. So I think that's the explanation. We did better than some other economies for a variety of reasons. I'll name just one obvious one, which is that we are energy independent. We have our own, we're the largest producer of hydrocarbons in the world. And so there was a countervailing factor there, as prices of energy went up. In Europe and UK, have not had that same benefit. In terms of going forward, I think one way in which the Fed's tightening was important and effective, and Dr. Cook talked about this yesterday, was in helping to keep inflation expectations, at least at the longer end, stabilized. We never saw Michigan 5-year expectations or break-evens at 10 years. We never saw a big move up in those. We had short-term expectations, but that was normal. And that made it much easier, to bring inflation back down to a sustainable level. And so I think that's something we knew, but it's really worth emphasizing. And so the question which arises is, okay, so suppose we have another oil price shock. What should we do?
What should you do? Yeah.
Well, the traditional answer to that question is, well, if you think it's a temporary shock, you look through it you ignore it, let it pass through the system, and then go back to where you were. Now, the qualification to that is that if it's big enough and long enough, and you don't do anything about it, it might begin to move inflation expectations in an adverse way. And so I think the lesson is that you do have to keep a close eye on expectations. And by the way, one of the reasons why the Fed's been able to bring the inflation down without much employment cost is that they have allowed expectations to go up a bit. Before the pandemic, TIPS break-evens were around 1.7, below the 2% target. Now they're 2.2. So the Fed had a little space to move there, and 2.2 is perfectly fine. That's the CPI expectation. That's about consistent.
Is it fair to say that they wanted to go in that direction anyways?
Well, I mean,
that's
right. I mean, it was essentially totally consistent with their framework. But I was talking with Annette Vissing-Jorgensen about the changes in the framework, and I think there are some things they're going to have to look at. But among other things, and I think this is true for central banks around the world, we have to be prepared for the fact that this is not your father's inflation or your grandfather's, as the case may be, that there are different kinds of shocks that can hit an economy, and the pandemic is just one example of something that really wasn't in the playbook. And we'll have to be much more flexible and recognizing both the diversity of shocks and forces we face and the openness. I mean, it was really a global event. And what happened in other countries affected the United States very much as well.
So let me now sort of move towards the fiscal side and think about the U.S. fiscal position. Mm-hmm. You talked about the importance of anchoring inflation expectations. But one positive outcome of surprising the market once was that some of the big spending that was done during COVID kind of paid for itself through the surprise inflation, but you obviously don't want to do it in some expectation sense. So in a world where we anchor expectations, inflation expectations in the long run, given the size of the government debt as a share of GDP, which has been rising and is projected to rise, I'm sure you're aware of the CBO mm-hmm. projections. Mm-hmm. What's your view on that long-run sustainability of U.S. Fiscal side, and do you have any suggestions on what to do about it?
Yeah, well, a small note. In fact, the debt-GDP ratio did go down, or projected in the last year, and that was because the inflation, got rid of some of it. But since the pre-pandemic period, that's not true, and debt has gone up. I think it's a fact, by the way, that people don't know that the fiscal programs enacted in response to the pandemic were 5 times bigger than what they did after the financial crisis, relative to GDP. So this was an all-hands-on deck, very big fiscal situation, and I'm not sure that we can always do that.
I'm tempted to ask, do you wish you had that in 2010?
Yeah. But a lot of it was investment, and it bears on the future. On debt and deficits. People, sometimes say, well, I have to balance my budget, and so the government should balance its budget. And that's not quite right, because the government can allow a certain amount of deficit and still keep the debt to GDP ratio constant. So to give you a numerical example, right now, both the US GDP and the outstanding government debt hands to the public are, more or less 30 trillion, roughly the same number. We are fortunate that the financing cost of the 30 trillion is below current rates because we financed a lot of it, before rates went up. But let's say eventually that financing costs of U.S. debt go up to 4%, let's say, which is where the 10-year is now. If that would mean that the interest payments on the debt would themselves be 4% of GDP, basically. And the rule of thumb is that as long as your deficit is equal to your interest payments, the debt to GDP ratio doesn't rise. So we could actually run a 4% of GDP deficit indefinitely without increasing the debt to GDP ratio. That's something that people got to get your head around that. It doesn't sound right, but it is right. But what the CBO projects for the next 10 years is not 4% deficits, but maybe 6% deficits. And so they project going from 100% of GDP debt to 120, which times 4% means that we then would be spending 5% of GDP on interest payments. And so that's a dynamically unstable
Cascades, yeah.
situation. Eventually, debt to GDP gets to be very high. It's already pretty high. It's already the highest it's ever been. So what is the consequence of that? Well, there are a number of risks, including, for example, debt limit machinations by the Congress, problems in the Treasury market like we saw in March of 2020. I think clearly, though, the real fundamental risk is not so much that there'll be an immediate financial crisis, because we, after all, sell our debt in dollars, and this is the deepest and largest financial markets in the world, but rather that the fiscal situation will get to the point where the interest is eating up such a large part of the government budget that it's squeezing the other components. And we have some, quote, mandatory parts, which are the entitlement spending. And so the rest of the budget, we've got defense needs. It's a dangerous world. We've got other non-mandatory spending. What this really means is not so much, of course, who knows, but I wouldn't expect a dramatic, stop. What I would expect, though, is increasing pressure on the political system to find ways to come closer to a more balanced budget. Mm-hmm. And that stabilizes the debt to GDP ratio. And that's why I said earlier that I think our political dysfunction is a problem, and because these problems could be solved, I think, with goodwill and cooperation and compromise.
So let's talk about the other debt, which is private debt, mm-hmm. Which has also risen quite a lot, as you know, including household debt, but also corporate debt more generally. So in this world that we now live in, compared to the 80s, like you mentioned, it's not our fathers or grandfathers' world anymore. That's one important sense in which the world is different, that it's a world with much higher levels of private debt as well as government debt, not just in the US, but the world over. That's true for all major economies in the world. Does that change the calculus for monetary policy? Because obviously now the rates that you change are getting multiplied with a much larger denominator, which is the outstanding amount of debt out there. How do you see that in your own kind of experience, but certainly going forward?
Well, as I once heard somebody say, to put this in the larger context of my own research, about 40 years ago, Mark Gertler and I wrote some papers about the credit channel of monetary policy. And the argument we made...
I heard you got some prize for that.
No, yeah. And the argument we made at the time was exactly what you're saying, which is that in a world where you have indebted households and firms, when the Fed raises interest rates, one of the ways in which that slows the economy is by putting more pressure on financially weaker entities and causing them to reduce their spending and so on. So in a sense, the situation you're referring to, the high level of debt, makes monetary policy stronger. Maybe it has to move less then because it's got more bang for the buck, so to speak. So that's certainly something that I think the Fed has looked at and as thinking about. Now, the other consequence, though, and I know you've been concerned about this, is that what about financial stability? And we saw problems a year ago with Silicon Valley Bank, with higher interest rates, reduced the value of their treasury holdings and so on. And I think that's a real issue. I would like to make one observation, which is that when you think about the amount of debt in the economy, it's important to take sort of what I would call a matrix perspective. And what I mean by that is it doesn't matter, the total amount of debt is not all that useful a number. What matters is who owes it and to whom. Who are the creditors, who are the debtors, and how do they link up? The worst kind of situation is one where a weakened banking system owns the debt of a weak household sector. We saw that, by the way, in 2007 and 2008, because when that happens, then you have the risk that a downturn in housing prices, say, can cause the household sector to become very financially strained, and that in turn affects the stability of the banks, and we know what kind of consequences that can have. So I think it isn't so much that reducing total debt, other than we talked about the federal debt already, but debt per se is not really a sufficient statistic for what we're concerned about. What we're concerned about fundamentally is strong household balance sheets and stable financial sector. So there, what the Fed and the other regulatory agencies have typically done is try to be proactive and try and take steps in advance to strengthen the system. And they've done a bunch of things. Banks are better capitalized and they're pushing for more capital. Banks have better liquidity, and there's resolution schemes for dealing with failing banks. Household sector is relatively good shape on most criteria. We have a macro prudential council, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, headed by the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. So we have done a number of things to try to reduce those risks. That being said, I think there are other areas that still need attention. I would mention, for example, the shadow banking system, where a lot of our credit comes from. That's non-bank lenders who are not overseen with the same effort and safety and soundness criteria that our banking system has. So there are definitely still risks in the financial system.
Do you have any on the shadow banking system, which remains very large, as you mentioned? Do you have any sort of thoughts on what should be done about that?
There's on the shadow banking system. I think if you walk like a bank and talk like a bank and sound like a bank, you ought to be regulated like a bank. So basically, you have a lot of institutions who function. They provide credit. They're funded short term. By money markets, maybe not by ordinary depositors, but by short-term funding sources, repo markets and the like. And the same dynamics of lost capital runs, et cetera, can happen there. So one of the things that, I don't want this to sound wrong way, but in the Depression, the SEC was created basically as a market regulator. It wasn't created as a safety and soundness regulator. And the SEC has oversight over most of the non-bank sector. And their focus is on making sure that investors and consumers are protected and that the markets are fair and open, which is all very important. But what they're not focused on, and they weren't focused on in 2007, was on whether or not these companies were fiscally and financially sound. So I think extending, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be the Fed, but extending oversight to some of the larger shadow banking companies would be important. And I wanted to mention one other direction, which the United States has chosen not to take. In a lot of countries, there are also restrictions on the kinds of mortgages and debt that you can issue. For example, many countries restrict mortgages in terms of the debt-to-income ratio, that you can put out. So we haven't done that either. So I think there are things that we could definitely do to make the system stronger, but I don't want to downplay the fact that the Dodd-Frank plus Basel has done a lot. And
but on that, how much do you worry about overdoing it something, like what people talk about too big to fail, or this so-called like the Fed put option that the market assumes it has? How much do you worry about that side of the risk in the long run?
Okay, so there's a couple issues. One issue, which is what the banks, I don't know if you saw the Bank Policy Institute or somebody had the bank lobbying group had a commercial on the Super Bowl, which they paid $7 million a minute or whatever, 30 seconds, whatever.
We have a Taylor Swift question, by the way. So
yeah. So what they're trying to argue is that higher capital requirements will raise the cost of credit and make your groceries more expensive somehow. I don't know exactly how that will happen, but so that I don't think is a big deal.
It's a good sign that they're putting that ad out.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's a couple of problems, though. I mean, one, let me get to the one you mentioned in just a second, but one problem is that when you raise capital on the banking system and don't do anything about the shadow banking system, that just means that all the risky stuff goes to the shadow banking system. And so that's even a stronger argument, I think, for a more even-handed approach. Now, your other question is about the moral hazard too big to fail. It's very hard for the government to say, you know, in a big financial crisis, we're not going to do anything. It's just not very credible to say that. So the best way to deal with it is kind of before the fact. And that means tough regulation and oversight, making sure that banks are stable and that shadow banks are stable. And it also means, at least to the extent possible, that there are ways to disassemble a large institution that don't necessarily bring around the rest of the system. When we dealt with the famous Lehman case, we had nothing like that. The only thing we could do was, the only thing it could do was go into bankruptcy, which meant a 10-year process by which some judge tried to decide, which of its creditors was going to be paid, and had no consideration whatsoever of the implications of it for the broad financial system. Now we have, and Europe has as well, and we coordinate with them, sort of various mechanisms by which, a company that was failing, could be broken apart and the good parts sold off and so on. So regulation and these kinds of provisions ex ante before the fact mean that maybe the thing doesn't happen in the first place. But it's very hard. When I was Fed chair and we were dealing with this, the president, George W. Bush, Republican, he went on television and said, here's why we have to bail out the banks. And I know that every bone in his body was like, I can't say this, I can't say this, I can't say this, but he did, because he had to. And it's just very hard, when the whole health of the economy is at risk, to let things just fall apart. So again, rather than promising things that you can't necessarily do, you have to make sure the system is as strong as possible in advance. And I think we really have learned, that stability of the financial system is very consequential, for the economy as a whole.
As they say, everybody is a Keynesian under some circumstances. So.
We're all, we're all budget people in foxholes, yes, I think, yeah.
Exactly. Very long run, how do you think interest rates, again, have been coming down? We were stuck at the zero lower bound for a while. Do you think we'll go back there? What's your long-run view on the interest rates?
So this is the question
and the forces behind
of the natural rate, the R star, and the paper we heard earlier about UK housing, more on that. By the way, you don't have to answer, but the answer, the conclusion that the real R star in Britain is 2.5% real, that seemed kind of high.
No, it was.
That was.
All right, we're talking another paper now.
Yeah, all right.
But that was not R star. The level is not R star.
Is that
it's
the
just
level?
the change in R star.
It's just the change. Okay, well, so what that showed was that despite the short-term fluctuations in monetary policy and the like, that this has been long-term downward trend, even in real terms. Even of course, part of the decline in nominal interest rates is due to lower inflation most of the time. But the real rate has been declining, and indeed before the pandemic, Martha, were you part of the Taylor, Schulerich? Were you part of that team that looked at the natural rate? There were some studies that showed that the real natural rate was really zero or negative in Europe, maybe. So there was a very strong consensus that the natural rate in real terms was very, very low. And currently the Fed thinks it's 0.5 in real terms, or about 2.5 in nominal terms. And so the question is, is that going to continue, or are we going to go back there? I think the forces which have driven down, besides lower inflation, the forces that have driven down the natural rate of interest are still very powerful. Those are primarily demographic. As the world ages, including not just the United States and Western Europe, but now China, Japan, of course, as well. You have fewer workers, which means the return on capital goes down. You have more savings, typically, which we know about savings gluts and how that drives down rates of return. And those forces are not changing, and so that powerful downward pressure is still going to be there. Now, on the other side, my own guess is that, although I don't really know, I think if I had to bet, I would say that we've had a slight increase in the neutral rate, since during the pandemic. And the reasons I give for that would be first, big deficits, which put a lot more, debt on the market and perhaps put some upward pressure on term premia. Then there's potentially some increased productivity. We saw almost 3% gains in productivity last year, which is probably not, I'm sure is not sustainable. But there are some reasons to think that productivity over the next decade will be stronger, and that also would tend to raise the natural rate. A third reason is that the Fed is now 300 basis points, right, 300 basis points above where it estimates the natural rate to be, and it doesn't feel, in looking at financial markets in general, stock market and so on, it doesn't look all that restrictive, or nor is the economy, slowing down very much. So that would suggest that maybe they're not as restrictive as they think, and that the R star might be a little higher than we thought before. So my guess is that R star is a little higher, that the Fed funds rate will stop declining at 3 or some number like that, which is a good thing, actually, because being at the zero lower bound was a tremendous constraint on policy whenever we had a recession or a slowdown. So that's my answer. There's no way to prove me wrong. I think the neutral rate will continue to be quite low unless there's some kind of productivity revolution. But it might have turned the corner a bit during the pandemic period.
So we're going to just start with the audience questions. But before I do that, a number of young people out there, and maybe Matt Damon and Tom Brady, they get really excited about private crypto markets sometimes. So how do you view the role of private crypto for the society as large, and I guess financial markets as well?
Well, I'm going to try to be family rated here. I don't think. I think Bitcoin. I think blockchain is a very interesting technology, and there may be some very good uses for that in managing inventories and various things. I don't think that that floating value crypto is a net social positive. I think it was intended to be a safe transaction medium, and it is neither safe nor a transaction medium. Its use case is primarily social negative, ransomware and terrorist financing and tax evasion, and those are the leading uses of Bitcoin. And not to mention the fact that it takes a lot of energy to generate the Bitcoin. So I'm not yet persuaded that this is something that has positive social value. I would guess that it actually doesn't. Now, supposedly we have a free market economy, and if people want to, create Bitcoin and trade it, there should be appropriate regulation. But I would try to resist the idea of banning it. But so again, I'm not a big fan, and that doesn't mean I don't agree that some people have made a lot of money, speculating in it. But that's not really the test of whether something is socially a good thing. There is a different class of crypto called stablecoin, which is crypto which is tied supposedly to the dollar, and has the advantage supposedly of being a quick way to make payments. You and I sitting here, and I want to pay you $5, I can do it with a stablecoin. It's possible that there might be some advantages to that. I think that we already have really that technology is already, with PayPal and Venmo and all these other things already exist. And we've already seen some risks that the stablecoin companies who promise to have 100% backing, that for short periods at least, they don't have 100% backing, and then you have sort of a run situation. That actually happened after the Silicon Valley Bank episode. So I have my doubts about stablecoin as well, although I think at least there is at least potentially a plausible use case in improving the transaction system. And again, our attitude generally is we shouldn't, as long as consumer protections and so on are respected, I don't think we should be banning things like that. They should let it evolve and see what comes out. But so far, I would class crypto under the good try but no cigar category.
Thanks. This is the PG version, right? So yeah.
That was the PG version.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks a lot. We'll open up now for audience. So,
first of all, Ben, I'd like to say how happy I am to see you back on campus. This morning we heard about the housing sector, the equity sector, etc., and industrial policy. Mm-hmm. My question is about the healthcare sector, mm-hmm. which is the largest sector in our economy. We're now 2021 was 18 point something, mm-hmm. and 22 is 17 something. But the CMS puts health care as a percent of GDP at 20% by the year 2031. So, and historically, the healthcare sector always outpaced GDP growth by 2 to 2.5%. And is that a concern to you as a CEA chair, as a Fed chair? And what kind of discussions?
Maybe I can respond quickly to each.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a big issue. We spend more in the we spend more in the U.S. as a share of GDP on healthcare than do countries that have complete, universal healthcare. And so we have a very inefficient system. I think there's some offsets. I mean, I think we have some friends. This is just anecdotal, but they live in Oslo, in Norway, which has a universal system, and the husband had some difficult medical problem, and he flew to New York in order to get treatment. So we do, at least at the upper end, we have some very, very high quality care. But I agree, it's just a very inefficient system. And we've struggled for a long time to try to find ways to reduce cost. I think that your comment about 2% faster was true for a while. I think recently, at least, it's been a bit more stable. But
yes.
It certainly is way
COVID, yeah.
It's been way too much.
Yes.
And I'd hardly, Uwe Reinhardt's spouse, I don't think I really have a lot to add. But we were talking earlier about the fiscal deficit. Yeah. And compared to history, tax revenues as a share of GDP, admittedly assuming things like that the tax breaks, the Trump tax breaks aren't extended and things like that, but it's about the same as they've been historically, but the spending as a share of GDP is about 2 percentage points higher than it's been historically, and that's almost entirely healthcare and other mandatory spending. So I don't have a solution by any means, but it's clearly
my question
critical.
is, what is your take on the longer term implications for the U.S. economy as a whole? Does it make us less competitive? And, clearly it's inefficient because I'm thinking of the opportunity costs of this uncontrolled healthcare spending.
Well, it's right where you phrased the question is a little hard to disagree. I mean, I think, that the inefficient system, although again, it does have some bright spots, but is using resources we would rather use in other ways.
Veronica? Byron?
Thank you so much for your comments. How far would you go in regulating non-banks? And just full disclosure, I am a very experienced professional managing portfolios of securities. So when I look at the fiscal policy, monetary policy, and then regulators, what looks in very simple terms, one branch of government is issuing an enormous amount of debt. Another branch bought some but doesn't want any more, so they want to reduce their balance sheet. Another branch wants to regulate and reduce the private capital's ability to own all the debt that is coming out. So I'm just curious, how far would you go? Would it be just reporting? Would it be like boots on the ground regulatory? Would it be larger companies, smaller? How far
But
would you
have
go
to
with
ta-
non-bank regulation?
It depends on the function, you know, it depends what they do. And again, the thing I'm worried about is sort of a 2008 reprisal. I mean, a lot of the trouble was outside the banking system. It was in, you know, investment banks and consumer firms, et cetera. So anybody whose balance sheet, the health of its balance sheet affects its lending capacity, and its lending capacity is to a vital sector of the economy and is big enough. I'm not saying that they have to be regulated in every detail, but they have to, somebody needs to make sure that they have enough capital, that they're safe and sound. I think that's not too much to ask, and that's what other countries do. Now, hedge funds that have private clients who want to speculate in currencies or something, that, you know, if they lose money, or if you lose money in crypto, God bless you. You know, I mean, it's whatever you want. That's not going to hurt the economy in a significant way. But when you have you're a vital credit provider, and your safety and soundness has implications not only for credit extension, but also for the banks and other institutions that you may owe money to, then I think that's a risky thing that needs attention from somebody.
So you're an expert in Great Depression. And we talked a lot about the U.S. I'm kind of curious your view on China. There have been terms like Japanification, balance sheet recession, all that being attempted to be used on China. So that's question number one. And question number two is, as the country or the West is onshoring or friendshoring, how does that affect the inflation or inflation expectation?
Well, in China, I've been to China a number of times, but not recently. We've all known for a long time that they have certain longer-term issues, most important one being demographic, but they're also having, obviously, big problems with their housing sector, which affects their finances. It seems to me that the president is trying to focus on maintaining the party's power, and is sort of pulled back some on the liberalization reforms, you know, moving outside the state-owned enterprises and so on. So it's still a tremendously powerful economy with lots and lots of potential, but surely it's confronting. Its problem is, to oversimplify, it had a certain growth model for a long time, and that growth model is coming to the end of its utility, and they need to update and upgrade their growth model to be more frontier technology, more higher sophistication in terms of production, et cetera, and less reliance in particular on infrastructure and housing, more on consumer spending. So they have some very difficult transitions to make, and I suspect that they will do that, but it is a kind of a tricky period. I think the friendshoring, I don't think it's, if you look at international trade statistics, there's not a big reduction in international trade. For example, and again, this is out of my real bailiwick, but a lot of Chinese exports are just routing, indirectly through Mexico or somewhere else. So it's a little bit hard to keep track, but globalization is not expanding the way it was, but I don't think it's really reversing. Linda Goldberg would know better than me, huh?
Thank you, Dr. Bernanke, for your insight. I have two questions. You mentioned weak lenders and weak borrowers. So how do you square this current regional banking crisis and commercial real estate? And second question, you said monetary policy is not restrictive enough. So would you say cutting rates this year would be a policy mistake?
Well, on the second one, when you're the ex-CEO, you don't want to second guess your successor. So I'm not going to do that. But I didn't really say anything like that. What I said was that it could be that a reason that the economy hasn't slowed as much as people projected is that rates are not as restrictive as the 2.5% estimate would suggest. It's just a possibility. I didn't make any normative suggestion about what they should do, and I have a lot of confidence that they've got a couple hundred PhDs there, and I think they probably know more about this than I do at this point. On the commercial real estate, I think that's a legitimate concern. It is something that at least people are really aware of, and I know there's a lot of close attention to what's happening. It's mostly a problem with medium and smaller banks, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem. It's still a problem. But the goal here is, as interest rates come down and as the economy, if it continues to do okay, is to gradually work out of that issue. So, it ties into a lot of, there's a lot of interesting ways to go with this because, of course, the reason for the problem in the first place is working from home, which has a lot of other consequences for productivity, for labor force participation and a variety of things. And so in Washington, where I live, all these federal buildings are kind of empty because the federal workers only have to come in twice a week or something. And so then the question is, can these empty office buildings be converted into something else? So yeah, it is. I think if you had to identify one area, I think that would be it. But at least I would say that as best as I can tell, the regulators are on the job. An interesting document that you might want to read once a year. Every summer, the FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, puts out a financial stability report, which goes into some detail on the various risks to financial stability. And the Fed also puts out twice a year, I think, a financial stability report. So there's that's just very different from where we were before the crisis. Now just a lot more explicit attention to financial risks than there were, 20 years ago.
Princeton students, I want to give them a chance. Are there Princeton students in the room? Okay, yeah, in the back, the gentleman with the blue sweater, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bernanke, for your comments. I had a question about the stability and protections around the treasury market, and this sort of harks back to your comments about an argument for being even-handed is that risk might transfer to non-banks. So I guess specifically, you can think of treasuries as a long-term interest-bearing asset, but also at certain times of crisis, like a money-like asset where there's a deep need for liquidity. Mm-hmm. So I was curious what your thoughts or comments were on where the responsibility should lie in the current market for providing the liquidity, and in the sense of right now, some of that is with hedge funds in the basis trade, some of it is still with banks. So yeah.
Are you an undergraduate? No.
Yes.
Wow.
You're doing a good job.
Yeah, no, he's talking about March 2020 when we had a mini, not mini, it was pretty sharp. Didn't last very long because the Fed was on the ball. Financial crisis where basically the treasury markets were not functioning and people who were counting on treasuries for liquidity were unable to obtain liquidity very quickly. And the problem was, in part, that banks at least complained that the dealers, the banks and the investment banks that normally buy treasuries and make markets, complained that they didn't have enough, that their capital requirements restricted how much they could handle. And given that there was a sudden wave of fear at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a big demand for cash, and the banking system just couldn't handle it, and we had problems spilling over into a lot of different markets. So it was a very scary period. One of the things that I learned from history. I mean, one of the best economists of the 19th century, who was not even an economist, he was a publisher, was Walter Bagehot, whose Lombard Street book basically said that the central bank needs to provide liquidity when the markets can't do it, and that's what the Fed did in big scale. So in terms of the future, again, like I was saying earlier, when you have problems like that, rather than making the incredible promise that you won't do anything after the fact, you want to do stuff in advance that will make that less likely. And I can think of a couple things. One is that the Fed has created a permanent repo facility where people can bring treasuries and get cash. And that'll help, and that'll reduce some of the strain on the dealers. Something else, there've been a number of suggestions. Darrell Duffy, who's a professor at Stanford Business School, has suggested a central clearinghouse for treasuries. And there are various ways that you could make that market more efficient, and if the private sector ought to have incentives to do it, but there are some externalities, and maybe the government or the Fed or somebody could encourage that. But it's absolutely, I mentioned that before, it's absolutely a risk in our very complex financial system.
We'll take one last question from the audience. Somewhere, Veronica, you pick. So.
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bernanke, for being here today. So I wanted to just ask a question in terms of shadow banking and risks to financial stability. I wondered if there were any particular institutions or types of firms you're particularly worried about in terms of that are operating in the shadow banking market and in terms of risk to financial stability.
Well, I mean, part of the problem, well, first of all, I'm no longer obviously part of the regulatory apparatus, and I don't see the reports and the numbers. And part of the problem, even for those who are part of the regulatory apparatus, is that the data collection, is not very comprehensive, and so you don't really know what the obligations are. And so no, I'm not identifying any particular company or industry at this moment, just saying that it's worrisome to me that we have as little information as we have, and that the regulators are not as focused as I think they should be on specifically safety and soundness, as opposed to the very important things they do about consumer protection and transparent markets, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to deny that, but the way things have shaken out, it's all accidental. The way the U.S. regulatory system grew up was based, Congress responding to one crisis after another and creating a new agency, and it's not a coherent system. And in particular, you've got 3 regulators of the commercial banks, including some very good regulators who are very attentive to safety and soundness, and then the rest of the financial system, which is more than half of it, is regulated by securities regulators like the SEC and the CFTC. And again, I'm not criticizing them. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing, but the way Congress set them up, again, their function is not to do the safety and soundness part, which I think is really important. But no, I don't know of a specific, I just know that in my own experience, in the financial crisis, that was where a lot of the problems were, starting with, investment banks and thrifts and mortgage companies and so on and so on. And while some of that has been taken care of, I would like to be assured that it was under good control.
Ben, let me try to close on a more serious note. People on social media have attributed at least part of the inflation to Taylor Swift. Do you have a take on that?
They said what?
That Taylor Swift, her concerts, it's a demand side effect that she's created inflation as a result of her popularity. What coefficient do you give to her for creating?
Let me say, I don't know anything about her music, but I think she's an excellent businesswoman. She's done really good work on that side, and I have a lot of respect for her. We have the same birthday, I found out, by the way. Yeah. Yeah, I did find that out, didn't I? Actually, I think, I mean, I don't really know. I mean, they said it's not big enough to really make big macro effects. They said there was seismic activity around some of her concerts. I think if I had to make if this was an exam question, I'd say, well, this is one woman generating billions of dollars of output. I think that's a productivity gain.
Yeah.
And that should be anti-inflationary. So that would be my. And you can tell her I said so when next time.
Yes, the supply side thing, yes.
Okay.
We'll put a press release out.
Yeah.
Ben, thank you so much. One last question. You have had this incredible career, which really stands out. Among incredible careers, it stands out because you have been obviously as successful as one can be as a Princeton professor in your academic life, winning the Nobel, but then at the same time being the Fed chairman, and not just being a Fed chairman, but being the Fed chairman at one of the most consequential times in US history. But life is about trade-offs. So if you can only pick one of the two, which one would you pick?
Well, it's a question, which is worse, a financial crisis or an 8 a.m. class?
So you're the only one who's experienced both, so
Yeah.
you tell.
Fortunately, this isn't an issue for me at the moment, so I don't have to decide. But I guess I should say, being back here at Princeton, that those were incredibly productive years for me. We raised our kids here. We lived here for a long time. And it's very good to be back. And thank you for the warm reception.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you all.